We finished up last time looking at example 2 and doing the 3 by 3 system there. We went through and did these operations right here, wrote down the shorthand, started off with the augmented matrix right here, and then ended with this in reduced row echelon form so we could just read off the answer. Turned out things were relatively easy on this one. They don't always go that way. There were several steps that were done for us or kind of knocked each other out, two birds with one stone, so to speak. So we're going to take a look at two more examples now. And when we look at these examples, things might turn out a little bit differently. So the first thing I want you to notice on this one is if we were to translate this into an augmented matrix, we're going to come over here and we're going to write this down. This would be 1. And the minute we write a 1 there, we say, okay, goal number 1 is taken care of for us. So this is a 1, and a 2, and then we've got a 2 and a -1 and a 3, and then a -7. We've got a 1, a -1, and a 6. Always a good idea to double check yourself, make sure that you're really careful when you write those things down, because if you write the wrong thing down here and then put the wrong thing in the calculator, you're going to get the wrong answer. It's going to be really frustrating. So I'm going to clear this off. We're going to go to the matrix menu and we're going to edit this. So it's already a 3 by 4 here, so we don't need to edit the dimensions. So we're going to do a 1, a 1, and a 2 at the end there. And then we've got a 2, a -1, and a 3, and a -7, and a 1, and a 1, and a -1, and a 6. Now, I'm using a stylus here, so this takes me a little while to type this in. With the thumbs, it goes pretty quickly. So let's just double check here, see if we've got this in the right way. This looks pretty good to me, so here's what we're going to do. We're going to go back to the home screen. It's all cleared off. We're going to display the matrix so we can have one more shot to look at it. And I've kind of been looking over here. I kind of like when I do my check right here, I kind of like making sure that things match up by looking at either the equations in rows or columns. And I think we are in good shape. We're all set to go. Again, if you take an extra 30 seconds to make sure your equations are right and your rows are right, you're much more likely to get the right answer. It's going to avoid some frustration there. So goal number 1's taken care of for us. So I'm going to take a look at this and we're going to say, okay, what do we add to 2 to make it a 0? -2. So we're going to take a -2. We're going to multiply it by row 1 and we're going to add it to row 2. What do we add to 1 to make it a 0? We add a -1. So we're going to do -1 times row 1 and we're going to add it to row 3. So we're going to go ahead and type that command in. So again, we're going to hit second in matrix. Do some math here, hit the up arrow. We're going to times a row and we're going to add -2, comma, name of the matrix. Let's see, matrix A, and we're going to do comma row 1 and we're going to add that to row 2. There we go. Okay, notice that it did what we want, so we're in good shape there. So we're going to save that. So we're going to hit store, name of the matrix, matrix A, hit enter, and we've stored that. Now, I could stare at this again, or I can just say, hey, we've figured this out already. It's a times row add command, which we just did one of those. So I'm going to put a 3 right here, because I know that's got to change. I'm going to kind of work this backwards. That does need to be a 1. We're still in the matrix A, and that needs to be a -1. So that's what I need to edit. I'm going to hit enter, and again, you'll notice that it did what we want. So that's fantastic. We're in good shape there. It also put a 0 right here, so that's great. So we are going to recall that store command. We like what it did there. Now, there are lots of different ways to do this. I generally prefer to just go through and say, all right, I need to make that a 1 and then use that 1 to make the zeros. So let's ignore this one for the time being. I realize you might be able to look at that and see what Z is right now, but we're going to leave that alone. We're going to look at this one. So we need to turn -3 into a 1. Well, what do we multiply by to turn that into a 1? Well, we multiply by the reciprocal. We multiply by its multiplicative inverse. So that's going to be -1/3 times row 2. So all we're doing is turning that into a 1 right now. So let's grab the times row command, which is matrix math. So times row is right there, and we're going to do -1 divided by 3, comma, the matrix A, and let's see which row. We're going to do row 2. Okay, so we hit enter. Did that do what we want? Now, this looks really ugly, but you'll notice we can still see the first 2 columns, and we can see that our goal right here was to turn that into a 1. So it did work. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to do 2 things. First thing I'm going to do is I'm going to store that because it did turn it into a 1, and even if the rest of that stuff looks ugly, That's totally okay. So notice we've still got this ugliness going on here, but I want to show you something that you can do that might be a little bit comforting. I'm going to hit math, and you'll notice the first thing under math is arrow fraction, so change to a fraction. So it's going to take that answer and it's going to change it to a fraction. Now notice we did already store this, so this is just showing us what a looks like in fraction form. So this is just the fraction negative 1/3. Well, we can deal with that. That's not too bad. It's not as horrible as it looked before, and you may have recognized it from the 0.3 repeated. That's a common rational number there, common decimal form. So we're going to take this 1 and use that 1 to make that a 0. So what do we add to 1 to make it a 0? A negative 1. So we're going to do negative 1 times row 2, and we're going to add it to row 1. So let's see here. We've already got that stored, so we need a times row command. And again, sometimes you have to decide, is it worth me going back and finding one, or should I just build it from scratch? You'll notice that this is a negative 1 already. That's great. We're going to do row 2, and we're going to add it to row 1. So let's see if this does what we want. Again, don't be concerned with the ugliness right here. It made that a 0, so we're going to store this. So I'm going to hit second enter a couple of, second enter a couple of times. Don't want it to store the answer as a fraction. I want it to store it in A, and there we go there. Now, I am going to go through and change this to a fraction so we can look at this. So we're going to hit math again, change that answer to a fraction. So, gosh, these are kind of ugly right now, but we can deal with that. But remember, we always want to deal with the 1 in the column first. So I need to make that into a 1. So we're going to multiply by, let's see, what do we multiply negative 2 by to make it a 1? We multiply it by its reciprocal, its multiplicative inverse. That's going to be negative 1/2. We basically take that and flip it over. So this is going to be negative 1/2 times row 3. Now you'll notice that 2 back we've got a times row command. So again, sometimes you just make a decision about whether it would be quicker to recall it or do it from scratch. And it looks like that wasn't too bad. So we're going to do a negative 1/2 here. And we're going to do row 3 there. Hit enter. All right, and there you go. Again, we don't need to worry about the ugliness right there. We are going to store that. So I'm going to hit second enter a couple times so we can store that. Store that right there. And let's change it to a fraction. So we're going to hit the math button. And there we are. Okay, now this is where it really comes in handy. If we look at this and say, hey, rather than having to display this each time so we can see what the fraction is, let's just go ahead and take care of these two at the same time. So we're going to write down 2 commands and then we'll just carry those out. So we're going to use this 1 to turn that into a 0. So what do we add to negative 1/3 to turn it into a 0? 1/3. So we're going to do 1/3 times row 3 and we're going to add it to row 2. Let me make that look like a 3 there. And then what do we add to 4/3 to make it a 0? We add negative 4/3. So this is going to be negative 4/3 times row 3, and we're going to add that to row 1. Okay, looks good there. I think we're in good shape. So here's what we're going to carry out. Now it may end up that we have fractions in the answer. That's okay. We can deal with that, no problem. So let's go ahead and grab that times row add command. So I'm going to go back here a little bit. I don't think it's back there too far. Let's see how far. May have been better off typing it in from scratch. Well, let's see. So I need a 1/3. So I'm going to do a 1 divided by, and again, that's on top of a comma, so we're going to need to insert. So 1/3, got the matrix A. We're going to do row 3, and we are going to add it to row 2. So we're going to hit enter, and hopefully that turns that into a 0. Notice that it did. Again, we're not concerned with the ugliness up there. I'm going to go ahead and recall that store command. And we don't need to worry about what this is because we figured that out before when it was written in fraction form. So I'm going to recall that times row command, and there's something nice about this. We've already got the 3rd in there. I just need a negative and a 4. So I'm going to insert a negative and a 4. I'll delete the 1, so there's our negative 4/3. It's still row 3 that's being multiplied, and then we're adding that to row 1. And we hit enter, and lo and behold, after all of that ugliness with all of those decimals or fractions that showed up there, we get a nice answer like this. So in the end, here's what we're going to write down. We are going to write down, and I almost forgot to store this. Again, don't want to forget to do that. So we're going to write down, again, in reduced row echelon form. Let's see what we got here. 1, 0, 0, 0, 1, 0, 0, 0, 1, and then here's our answers, 1, 3, and negative 2. Okay, so there we go, and then we're going to write down a 1, a 3, and a negative 2. Here's the answer because that's the x, that's the y, and that's the z. Okay, I realize that's a whole bunch of stuff going on, lots of things to keep track of. Remember, this is not just about getting the answer. It's not just, hey, I can get this answer right here. It's really about the thinking that this develops in your brain as you do this. I mean, think about all the complex things that are going on. You're providing a lot of what we call executive functions. You're the one making the decision, and then you're having something else carry those out. So let's take a look at the last one. This is actually a problem from your assignment, and this draws your attention to a couple of places where you have to kind of think outside the box just a little bit. So the first thing I want you to notice is there's not a 1 right here in that first position. Goal number 1 is not accomplished for us already, and we can't just switch rows and stuff like that. So that creates a little bit of a problem. The second thing I'd like you to notice is that this one right here does not have a y in it. Now, I don't do this all the time. There are times where I will forget to write down the augmented matrix. I go directly from the problem and I just type it in there and then I write down the shorthand for it. It really is a good idea to write that down each time because if you don't write it down, you may lose track that there's supposed to be a 0 for the y. So we've got negative 3 and 3 and 10 and negative 29. And then we've got a negative 2 and a 0 and a negative 1 and a negative 6. And a 2, and a negative 3, and a negative 5, and a 15. And again, sometimes I forget to write the line, sometimes I make it dotted and stuff like that. As long as it's very clear what you're working with and you write the shorthand, we're going to be okay. So again, there's not just one way to do these. There sometimes is a better way or a quicker way, but as long as it works and you're writing down your operations, that's totally fine. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to take this row right here. I'm going to take row 3 and I'm going to multiply it by 2 and I'm going to add it to row 1. Now here's why I'm going to do that. I want to turn this into a 1. Well, if I add 4 to a negative 3, that turns it into a 1. And I can really easily take this and multiply it by 2. That turns it into a 4. And then I can add it to row 1. I could do the same thing here, but I just have to multiply by negative 2. Now, it doesn't matter a whole lot, but wait a minute. Notice that this one right here has a 0 in it. This one has a 3 in it. Okay, if we were doing this by hand, it would be easier whenever there's a 0. So that's going to mess things up less if we do that one. So on this one, here's what I'm going to do. I think I'm going to change my mind. I'm going to take row 2, and I'm going to multiply it by negative 2, because that's going to turn that into a 4, and I'm going to add it to row 1. So let's see what happens here once we get this typed in. So let's go to matrix. Let's edit. Let's put this in the calculator. It's already 3 by 4. We've got a negative 3, a 3, a 10, and a negative 29. And then we've got a negative 2, and a 0, and a negative 1, and a negative 6, and a 2, and a negative 3, and a negative 5, and a 15. Again, last chance to double check. Let's see, we look good there. We look good there. Again, check over here with the Y column. Looking good there, and that looks fine right there. Again, if we double check here, that's also helpful if you do that. So I think we're in good shape. I'm going to hit second quit. We're going to go back here. We're going to clear off the home screen. We're going to display the name of the matrix. Our last chance to double check this is right here. So if you're a little shaky, if you weren't sure you hit all the right buttons and stuff like that, now's your chance to double check that. Now the cool thing is we were already thinking ahead. So we think if we multiply this row by negative 2, turning that into a 4, and add it to row 1, that's going to turn that into a 1. So let's make the calculator do this. So I know that back here just a little bit is a times row command. And we're going to make that a 2. We're going to delete that stuff. We already have the name of the matrix. We're doing row 2, and we're adding that to row 1. So we're going to hit enter. Okay, so that looks good. Didn't mess things up too bad, and it turned that into a 1. So I like that. It did what we want. Goal number 1 accomplished. So we're going to hit, let's see, matrix, and whoops, let me go back to the home screen. Forgot to hit store first. So we're going to store that in A. Again, it's just a decision as to which is going to be quicker, make it from scratch or go back and recall it. And then let's do 2 steps at once. What do we add to a 2 to make it a 0? A 2. So we're going to do 2 times row 1 and add to row 2. And then what do we add to 2 to make it a 0? A negative 2. So we're going to do negative 2 times row 1, and we're going to add it to row 3. Now, thinking ahead just a little bit, I'm going to put in this second one first. And I'll show you why. Because it's got a negative in it. If I do that, and I think that previous one also had a negative in it, look how similar those two commands are. And we also don't have to do an insert when we come to this one the next time. So let's go ahead and do that one. So I'm going to recall. There we are right there. So there's -2 already. All we have to do is change that to a 1 and that to a 3 and hit enter, and let's see what it did. It did what we want. It turned that into a 0, so we're in great shape there. So we like that. So we're going to hit second enter. We're going to store that. We need to turn that into a 0. So this is the one where we do 2 times row 1 and add to row 2. So we're just going to recall that. And again, the cool thing is you've got the thinking out of the way. You already wrote that down. So all you have to do is figure out, okay, I need to change that to a 2. And we need to change that to a 2 also. So I'm going to hit delete. And this is that command right there. And notice how easy it was to edit that because of the order we did it in. So we're going to go ahead and hit enter. Okay, we're in great shape there. Looks good. We're going to store that. Now, when I say great shape, that's all relative because if you look at this, here's our next step. Our next step is to turn that into a 1. And you'll notice that if I take that and turn it into a 1 by multiplying it by its reciprocal, we're going to get 6th here. This is going to be 6 over 6, which will be 1. We like that. But this is going to be 23 over 6, and that's going to be -40 over 6. So that's going to turn into a bit of a nightmare. But let's go ahead and the calculator doesn't have any problem dealing with that. So let's focus on the task at hand, and that is turning this into a 1. So we're going to multiply by the reciprocal. So this is going to be 1/6 times row 2. So I think that's a ways back there. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to do matrix and math. We're going to times a row. We're going to times by 1/6. So 1 divided by 6. The matrix A, comma, and we're going to do row 2. So we're going to hit enter, and there we go. Now, again, we don't need to worry about these guys over here. Not a problem. The calculator is going to be able to deal with those when we get there. So let's look at this right here. We've got a 1, so that did what we want. So we're going to store that. So I'm going to recall that store command, hit enter, and there we go. Now, again, don't focus over here. Just focus on this column by column. We've got column 1 done. Now we're on column 2. Here's what we need to do. We need to take row 2, and we need to multiply it by 9 to cancel that one off. So we're going to do 9 times row 2, and we're going to add to row 3. We need to turn that 3 into a 0, so we'd multiply by -3. So -3 times row 2, and we're going to add to row 1. Now, of these two commands, I guess it's not a big deal which one you do first, but again, I'm going to do that one first because it's got a negative in it. So I'm going to go ahead and recall that times row command. It's not back here too far. It's right there. So we're going to do -3. Whoops. So we're going to insert this because there's not going to be enough room. -3. Delete that 2. And we're doing row 2. So row 2, and we're adding it to row 1. Okay, again, I'm doing this one first because it's got the negative in there. So we're going to go ahead and hit enter. It did turn that into a 0, so we're in good shape there. So we'll hit recall a couple of times, store that. Again, we're focusing in on this right here. We already did the thinking for this. We're just telling the calculator how to do this. So we're going to recall this very quickly. You'll notice that we need to change this to a 3. And we need to change this first one to a 9, and we're deleting rather than inserting, which generally is a little bit easier. So notice that we've got that shorthand instruction in there with the right syntax. We'll hit enter, and there we go. Now, look at this right here. We've got a 1, 0, 0, a 1, and a 0, and a 0, so we're in great shape there. We love what it did, and we didn't have to worry about the fractions at all or the decimals or anything. And here's where we are right here. Now, we need to display this whole thing, so I am going to have this change it into a fraction so we can see what's going on here. So this, we need to change that into a 1. So how do we turn an 11/2 into a 1? Well, this whole idea of the multiplicative inverse or the reciprocal, that's how we're going to do it. So we're going to take this and we're going to multiply by 2/11. Okay, so the 2 on the top would cancel the 2 on the bottom, and the 11 on the bottom would cancel the 11 on the top. So we're going to do 2/11 times row 3. So I'm going to make that from scratch because I can't remember how far back that was. So we're going to times a row. We're going to times by 2 divided by 11, comma, matrix A, and grab that name and row 3. Now, for those of you that might be looking at this and remember, hey, that was just a 5.5. Couldn't we have divided by 5.5? Would have been totally okay to do that. It would have worked out just fine. Thinking in terms of fractions is kind of a healthy way to do this, though. So we're going to go ahead and hit enter. Notice that that's a 1, so we're in great shape. So we are going to store that. And again, we don't care about the ugliness in the rest of the thing. We're just going to look at it right there. So I did change that to a fraction. I am going to store that, though. So we want to hit matrix A, store that in A. So there we go. All right. So here's where we are right now. Now at this point, we're almost done. I know this has been long, but we are almost done. So I need to turn that into a 0. So what do we add to negative 23.6 to turn it in, sorry, 23.6 to turn it into a 0? We add negative 23.6. Got ahead of myself there. So we're going to do negative 23.6 times row 3, and we're going to add that to row 2. All right, that should take care of this one. And then what do we add to 1/2 to turn it into a 0? Negative 1/2. So of course that's the number that we multiply, row 3, and we're going to add that to row 1. So we're going to go ahead and type this one in first. So I'm going to recall that times row command. And again, the awesome part about this is we already did the thinking here. So all we have to do is type this stuff in. Now I've got to fit a whole bunch of numbers in here and a sign. So I'm going to just hit second insert from the get-go. So 23 divided by 6, negative 23 divided by 6. And then whoops, we've got to delete that, matrix A. And we're doing row 3. These get pretty long and they're off the screen. And we're going to add that to row 2. Okay. Now, if this did what we want, oh, notice that. That's really nice. That turns into a 0. So that's excellent. So I'm going to store that. Don't know how back my store command was, so I just typed it from scratch. And then we're going to do this last one, which we've already written down. So that is going to be recall that times row add command. We're going to multiply by negative 1/2. Yep. So 1 divided by 2. Get rid of that guy right there. Okay, come to the end here, and what we're going to add to is row 1. So we hit a 1. And now this is kind of an interesting result. This will happen sometimes. I'm going to go ahead and store this so I don't mess anything up. And then we'll talk about what this weird number is right here. You'll notice that what's in the answer column are nice numbers. And I think on most of the problems on the assignment today, they do turn out to be fairly nice numbers. But if you take a look at this right here, this says -1 and then E negative 13. What this is the exponent. This is scientific notation. So this is a -1 with, let's see, we move the decimal 13 places to the left. So it's a negative, then a decimal, and then 12 zeros and a 1. This is a teeny tiny number. This happens a lot with calculators. They don't have the memory capacity to keep track of everything. It has to do with the algorithms that they use in there. So what this is saying is this is a teeny tiny number for the calculator. For all intents and purposes, it is a 0. And if you go back and look at the numbers that we had in here, it would be a 0 had we done the arithmetic. So this is a problem with calculators. You've got to know that this happens occasionally, and you've got to know what it means. So if you ever see an E and a negative number, that means the exponent on a 10. So if it's a negative number, it's a teeny tiny number. If it's a positive number, then it's a huge number. In this case, it's a small number. So it is in effect a 0. So here's what we're going to write down. We're going to write down the answer for the augmented matrix. So again, this is going to be in, reduced row echelon form. So we've got everything taken care of as far as this, the 3 columns here go. And then the answer would be 4 and 1 and -2. Put the negative on there. And then this is, of course, what we'd circle here, is this ordered triple. Now, tons of stuff to digest, lots going on here. Go ahead and do a little self-evaluation here. If you had to do this on your own after just looking at this, how do you feel? Maybe a little bit shaky. It does take some practice to get used to. Good luck on the assignment, and make sure you ask for help.